The day Amelia Morrison's bucket split open at the bottom, spilling 3 miles worth of creek water across the cracked Texas earth. She sat down in the dust and let herself cry for exactly 1 minute before standing back up to make the walk all over again. It was June of 1878, and the drought had turned Brownsville into a landscape of bleached grass and desperate prayers. Amelia had inherited her father's 40 acres 6 months earlier, when fever took him, and she had spent every day since trying to prove she could work the land alone. The problem was not the work itself, though that was back-breaking enough. The problem was water. Her property sat high on a ridge with good soil and decent grazing, but the nearest water was the creek 3 miles down and 3 miles back, and she made that journey 4 times each day just to keep herself and her 3 horses alive. She was 22 years old, and her hands were wrapped in calluses from the rope handles of the water buckets. Her dark hair had gone lighter from the sun, and her shoulders had grown strong from the carrying, but strength did not make water appear where there was none. Strength did not fix split bucket bottoms or cracked lips, or the way her small cabin felt like an oven by midday. The second bucket, older than the first, gave out that same afternoon. Amelia stood in her dooryard watching water seep into the ground, and she felt something close to defeat settle over her shoulders. She had 43 cents to her name. New buckets would cost more than that. She could ask for credit at the general store, but she already owed for flour and coffee, and the tin of axle grease she had needed last month. She could sell one of the horses, but she needed them to have any hope of planting winter wheat when the rains finally came, if the rains came. She was still standing there, dusty and exhausted, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. A rider was coming up the long approach to her property, sitting easy in the saddle on a rangy bay gelding. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a dark hat, and he rode like someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. Amelia straightened her spine and pushed her hair back from her face, aware of how she must look, covered in dust and dried tear tracks. The rider pulled up at her fence line and touched his hat brim. "Afternoon, madam. Name is Matthew Pierce. I am looking for work, and I heard in town that you might need a hand." Amelia almost laughed. "You heard wrong. I cannot afford to hire anyone. I did not ask about pay." He swung down from his horse with an easy grace and stood on the other side of the fence, looking at her with steady gray eyes. He was young, maybe 25, with a weather-beaten face and a quiet way of holding himself. "I am looking for a place to stay for a while. I can work for room and board if you have any work that needs doing." "Why?" Amelia asked bluntly. "Nobody works for free, Mr. Pierce. What do you really want?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of old pain quickly hidden. "I have been riding for 3 months, and I am tired of it. I heard you were out here alone, trying to make a go of it. Figured you might need help, and I need a reason to stay still for a while. That is the whole truth of it." Amelia studied him, weighing risk against need. He looked honest enough, and there was no meanness in his face, but she had learned to be cautious. Still, she thought of the broken buckets and the 3-mile walk and the 100 other things that needed doing around the property. "There is a lean-to on the east side of the barn," she said slowly. "It is not much, but it would keep the rain off if we ever get any. I can feed you, but I will not lie about the quality. I am not much of a cook, and supplies are thin. I have eaten worse, I promise you." Matthew tied his horse to the fence post and looked around the property with an assessing eye. "What is your biggest problem right now?" "Water." The word came out flat and exhausted. "The creek is 3 miles off, and I just lost both my good buckets. I have been hauling water since dawn, and I will be hauling it until dark every day until it kills me or the drought breaks." Matthew was quiet for a moment, looking at the land with those steady gray eyes. Then he said, "You ever think about digging a well? With what money? With what equipment?" Amelia shook her head. "I have thought about everything, Mr. Pierce. Thinking does not make it possible." "I know how to dig a well," Matthew said. "My father was a well digger in Kansas before he died. I worked with him from the time I was 12 until I left home at 18. I have the knowledge, and if you have basic tools, I can do the work. It will take time, but if there is water under this land, I will find it." Amelia stared at him, afraid to hope. "Why would you do that? A well takes weeks to dig, maybe months. You cannot possibly want to stay here that long just for room and board." Matthew met her eyes directly. "I have nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. Let me try. If I find water, you will have solved your biggest problem. If I do not, you are no worse off than you are now." She should have said no. She should have sent him back down the road and figured out her own solutions like she had been doing for 6 months. But she was so tired, and the broken buckets were still lying in the dirt at her feet, and the thought of months more of that 3-mile walk made her bones ache. "All right," she said. "You can try." Matthew Pierce moved into the lean-to that evening, carrying everything he owned in a single canvas pack and a bedroll. Amelia fed him beans and cornbread at her rough kitchen table, and they ate in the kind of silence that was not quite comfortable yet, but was not hostile either. After dinner, he walked the property with her in the cooling twilight, studying the land with a practiced eye. "There," he said finally, pointing to a low spot near the barn where the grass was slightly greener than the surrounding scrub. "That is where I would dig. The land dips there, which means water might collect underground. The grass is healthier, which supports that theory. I cannot promise anything, but that is where I would start." "Then start there," Amelia said. He began digging the next morning at first light. Amelia woke to the sound of his shovel biting into the earth, a steady rhythmic scrape that continued all through the day. She still had to make the walk to the creek, but with only herself to keep watered, she could manage with the 2 battered buckets she had left. She used the morning walk to check the fence line and moved the horses to better grazing. On the afternoon walk, she picked wild onions that grew near the creek bank. When she returned, Matthew had dug a hole nearly 4 feet across and 3 feet deep. He was stripped to his undershirt, covered in dirt, and his face was running with sweat in the brutal heat. Amelia brought him water, and he drank it in long, grateful gulps. "You should rest," she said. "You will make yourself sick working like that. I am all right." He handed back the empty bucket. "I am used to hard work, and the sooner this gets done, the better for both of us." Over the next weeks, a pattern developed between them. Matthew dug from dawn until the heat became dangerous, rested through the worst of the midday, and then worked again until dark. Amelia managed the rest of the property and cooked their simple meals. They talked during dinner, carefully at first, and then with growing ease. She learned that he had left Kansas after his father died, that he had worked ranches through Colorado and New Mexico, and that he had no family left anywhere. He learned that she had grown up on this land, that her mother had died when she was young, and that her father had taught her everything about horses and not nearly enough about wells. "He always meant to dig one," Amelia said one evening, watching the sun set behind the barn. "Every year he said this would be the year. Then the fever came and there was no more time for plans. This land meant something to him," Matthew said quietly. "I can see it in the way things are built. He took care with his work. It means something to me too. That is why I cannot let it go, even though everyone in town thinks I should sell and move somewhere sensible." Amelia looked at the darkening land, at the struggling grass and the endless sky. "This is mine. My father gave me that, and I will not throw it away just because it is hard." Matthew nodded slowly. I understand that. The well grew deeper. 5 feet became 10, and 10 became 15. The work got harder as Matthew descended into the earth, hauling buckets of dirt up on a rope pulley system he had rigged. Amelia helped when she could, pulling the rope while he filled the buckets below. She could hear him down there in the darkness, the scrape of his shovel against rock and clay, and sometimes she worried that the whole thing might collapse and bury him alive. "It is safe," he assured her when she voiced this fear. "I am bracing the walls as I go. See?" He showed her the careful framework of wood he had built from salvaged fence posts, shoring up the shaft as it descended into the earth. At 20 feet, the earth changed. Matthew brought up buckets of darker soil, damp and heavy. Amelia felt hope flare bright in her chest, but he cautioned her against it. Damp earth does not mean water yet. We need to go deeper. At 25 feet, he hit rock. For 3 days, he worked with an iron bar, breaking through the limestone layer piece by patient piece. Amelia could hear the ring of metal on stone from inside her cabin, a steady percussion that marked the passing hours. She found herself listening for it, and when it stopped, she found herself going outside to check that he was all right. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one evening when they sat on her porch steps, too tired to move any farther than that. "You could have moved on by now. You could be working a real job for real pay somewhere else." Matthew was quiet for a long time, looking out at the darkening land. "I like it here," he said finally. "I like having a reason to stay in one place. I like working towards something that matters. And I like your company, if I am being honest." Amelia felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the weather. Over the weeks, she had grown used to having him around. She liked the sound of his voice over dinner and the way he listened when she talked about her plans for the land. She liked his quietness and his steady competence, and she liked the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. "I like your company too," she admitted quietly. Something shifted between them after that conversation. It was nothing dramatic, no grand declarations or sudden revelations. It was in the small things. The way Matthew started making coffee in the mornings so it would be ready when she woke. The way Amelia started packing extra food for his midday meal. The way their hands would brush when passing tools or buckets, and neither of them would pull away quite as quickly as they might have before. At 30 feet, Matthew shouted up from the well shaft. Amelia ran to the edge and peered down into the darkness. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I found water." His voice echoed up from the depths, excited and breathless. Amelia felt tears spring to her eyes as she gripped the wooden frame of the well. "Are you certain? Is it real? Come down and see for yourself." She climbed down the ladder he had installed, moving carefully in the narrow space. The air grew cooler as she descended, and then she was standing at the bottom beside Matthew in the flickering light of his lantern. Water was seeping up through the broken rock at their feet, pooling in the low spots, clear and cold and real. "We did it," Matthew said, and his face was transformed by his smile. "We actually did it." Amelia started laughing, and then she was crying, and then Matthew was pulling her into his arms and holding her while she did both at once. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong, and she could smell earth and sweat and the distinctive scent of him underneath it all. When she finally pulled back to look up at his face, something in his expression made her breath catch. "Amelia," he said softly, and then he was kissing her. She kissed him back with all the pent-up loneliness and hope and fear of the past months, with gratitude and affection and the beginning of something deeper that she was almost afraid to name. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I should have asked first," he said. "I am sorry. I just could not help myself. Do not be sorry." Amelia covered his hands with hers. "I have wanted you to do that for weeks now." They climbed back up into the sunlight holding hands, and everything felt different. The work was not done, Matthew explained as they stood at the top of the well. The shaft needed to be dug deeper to create a reservoir, and they needed to install a proper pump system, and the walls needed to be finished properly with stone or brick. But the water was there, reliable and real, and that changed everything. Over the next weeks, as Matthew completed the well, their relationship deepened. They were careful with each other, cautious in the way of people who had both been hurt before and did not want to rush into something that might break. But the feelings were there, growing stronger every day. Matthew told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, and about his father, who had loved him but had been a hard man to know. Amelia told him about the loneliness of growing up without a mother, and about her father's long silences, and about how she had always felt like she was supposed to be more than she was. "You are exactly what you are supposed to be," Matthew said fiercely. "You are strong and stubborn and brave enough to hold on to this land when anyone else would have given up. Do not let anyone make you feel like that is not enough." In early September, Matthew installed the pump. Amelia worked the handle for the first time and watched clean water pour out into a bucket, and she felt something break open in her chest. No more 3-mile walks. No more cracked lips and aching shoulders and the constant fear of drought. The well would not solve all her problems, but it solved the biggest one, and that made everything else seem possible. "I do not know how to thank you," she said to Matthew that evening. They were sitting on the porch again, watching the stars come out. "You have given me back my life." "You gave me something too," Matthew said quietly. "You gave me a home, or at least the possibility of one if you will have me." Amelia turned to look at him, her heart beating fast. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I love you." Matthew took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I have loved you for weeks now, maybe from the first day when you were brave enough to take a chance on a stranger. I want to stay here, not just for a while but for good. I want to help you build this place into something real. I want to marry you if you will say yes." Amelia felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course yes." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and the land stretched out around them in the darkness, no longer quite so lonely. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Brownsville, with half the town in attendance out of sheer curiosity to see the Morrison woman marry the stranger who had dug her a well. Amelia wore her mother's dress, carefully altered to fit, and Matthew wore a new shirt he had bought with money from selling a saddle he no longer needed. The ceremony was simple, but when Matthew slid the plain gold band onto her finger and promised to love her for all his days, Amelia felt like she had everything she had ever wanted. They honeymooned at home, because there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be. Matthew moved his few possessions from the lean-to into Amelia's cabin, and they began the work of learning to live together as husband and wife. It was an adjustment, sharing space with another person after so many months alone, but it was also a joy. Amelia loved waking up to find Matthew already up and making coffee. She loved the sound of his voice reading aloud from the newspaper in the evenings. She loved the way he touched her, gentle and reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. "You do not have to be so careful," she told him one night as they lay together in the darkness. "I will not break." "I know," Matthew said, pulling her closer, "but you are precious to me anyway." With the well completed, they turned their attention to other improvements. Matthew repaired the fence line and rebuilt the worst sections of the barn. Amelia used water from the well to start a garden, planting vegetables that would see them through the winter. They bought a milk cow with money saved from selling their surplus eggs in town, and they talked about their plans for the future. Come spring, they would plant wheat in the south field. They would buy more horses and start breeding them. They would build a proper house, something bigger than the cabin, with room for children when they came. The drought broke in October. Amelia woke one morning to the sound of rain drumming on the roof, and she lay in bed listening to it with a sense of profound gratitude. Matthew stirred beside her and pulled her into his arms, and they stayed that way for a long time, listening to the rain and not talking, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The land responded to the moisture like it had been holding its breath. The grass turned green almost overnight, and wildflowers bloomed in the low places where water collected. Amelia's garden flourished, and the horses grew fat on good grazing. In town, people stopped looking at her with pity and started looking at her with respect. She was not the poor Morrison girl anymore, trying to hang on to land she could not manage. She was Mrs. Pierce, and she had a husband who knew how to dig wells and a property that was starting to thrive. Winter came gently that year, with cold nights and mild days. Matthew cut firewood while Amelia preserved vegetables from the garden. They spent the evenings by the fire, planning for spring and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Matthew would play his harmonica, simple tunes he had learned from his father, and Amelia would sing along when she knew the words. On Christmas morning, Amelia gave Matthew a new hat she had saved up for, and he gave her a wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with flowers and birds and her initials on the lid. She cried when she saw it, because it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her. "I love you," she said, kissing him. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Matthew said against her lips, "more than I knew it was possible to love someone." In February, Amelia realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Matthew, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Amelia asked, suddenly anxious. "It will make everything harder." "There will be more mouths to feed, more work to do." "I am so happy I could burst," Matthew said, setting her down carefully and cupping her face in his hands. "A baby is the best news I could possibly imagine. We will figure out the rest as we go." They started preparing immediately. Matthew built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Amelia sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric she bought in town, marveling at how small everything was. They argued good-naturedly about names, throwing out possibilities and rejecting them just as quickly. If it was a boy, Amelia wanted to name him after Matthew's father. If it was a girl, Matthew wanted to name her after Amelia's mother. "We will have to wait and see," Amelia said, her hand on her growing belly. "Maybe the baby will tell us what name is right." Spring came in a riot of color and new life. Matthew planted the wheat field while Amelia managed the lighter work around the property. Her belly grew round and heavy, and Matthew treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worried that she was doing too much. "I am pregnant, not dying," Amelia told him with exasperation when he tried to stop her from feeding the chickens. "Women have been having babies and working at the same time since the beginning of creation." "Not my wife," Matthew said stubbornly. "My wife is going to rest and let me take care of things." Despite her protests, Amelia found she liked being taken care of. She liked the way Matthew would rub her aching feet in the evenings, and the way he talked to her belly when he thought she was asleep, telling their baby about the well and the land, and all the things they would do together when the baby was old enough. She liked the way he looked at her, with wonder and love and something close to awe in June, almost exactly a year after Matthew had ridden up to her fence line, and offered to work for room and board. Amelia went into labor. Matthew rode to town for the midwife, pushing his horse harder than was probably wise, and then paced the dooryard like a caged animal while the woman worked inside. Amelia labored through the long afternoon and into the evening, and when the baby finally came, she was too exhausted to do more than hold out her arms for the tiny bundle. "A boy," the midwife said, placing the baby on Amelia's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Matthew came in a moment later, his face white with worry that transformed into joy when he saw Amelia and the baby both alive and well. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, marveling at the perfect miniature fingernails. "He is beautiful," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. "He is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "What should we name him?" Amelia asked sleepily, looking down at their son's scrunched-up face. "Thomas," Matthew said immediately, "after my father, if that is all right with you." "Thomas Pierce," Amelia tested the name. "It is perfect." Being parents changed everything and nothing at the same time. The work was still there, the land still needed tending, but now there was this tiny person who needed them even more. They took turns walking Thomas when he cried at night, and they marveled at every small change as he grew. Matthew built a sling so Amelia could carry the baby while she worked, and she sang to him while she did the chores. Old songs her father had sung to her when she was small. Thomas thrived. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and he had Matthew's gray eyes and Amelia's dark hair. As he grew, he developed a fascination with anything that moved, watching the horses with intense concentration and reaching for the chickens when Amelia brought him outside. "He is going to be a rancher like his mother," Matthew said proudly, watching Thomas crawl determinedly toward a barn cat. "Or a well-digger like his father," Amelia countered, laughing when the cat evaded the baby's grasping hands. The years passed in a blur of seasons and small milestones. Thomas took his first steps on a warm spring day, walking from Amelia to Matthew and back again with intense determination. He said his first word, which was "da," much to Matthew's delight and Amelia's mock outrage. The wheat crops came in strong 2 years in a row, and they were able to save money for the first time since Amelia's father had died. They bought more land, another 20 acres adjoining their property, and they talked about buying cattle to go with the horses. When Thomas was 3, Amelia became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and she was calmer about the whole process. Matthew was not any calmer, still treating her like she might shatter at any moment, but she had learned to find it endearing rather than annoying. "You do know I have done this before," she reminded him when he tried to lift a basket of laundry that she was perfectly capable of carrying herself. "And you will do it again next time," Matthew said cheerfully, taking the basket anyway. "That does not mean I am going to stop helping you." Their daughter was born in the fall, during the golden October days when the light turned everything warm and mellow. The birth was easier this time, and when the midwife placed the tiny girl in her arms, Amelia felt a fierce rush of love so intense it took her breath away. "Sarah," she said, looking down at her daughter's perfect face, "after your mother." Matthew kissed Amelia's forehead, then the baby's. "Sarah Pierce, welcome to the world, little one." Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her and touch her and bring her all his favorite toys. They had to teach him to be gentle, but he was a natural older brother, protective and sweet. Amelia watched Matthew with both children, saw the patience and love he showed them, and fell in love with him all over again. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas play in the yard while Sarah slept in her cradle beside them. When you rode up that day and offered to dig a well, did you imagine any of this? Matthew was quiet for a moment, thinking. I imagined a place to rest for a while. I imagined honest work and a meal at the end of the day. But this, he gestured at the thriving land, at their children, at the life they had built together. This is better than anything I could have imagined. You gave me everything, Amelia. A home, a purpose, a family. You gave me a reason to stay still and stop running. You gave me those things too, Amelia said softly, taking his hand. Before you came, I was barely surviving. I was strong enough to hold on, but not strong enough to build anything real. You changed that. You made this possible. We made it possible, Matthew corrected. Together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the barn and paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The well stood near the house, its pump gleaming in the last light, a monument to where they had started and how far they had come. Water flowed freely now, feeding the garden and the animals and the life they had built together on this land. Thomas ran over, dusty and happy, climbing into Matthew's lap without hesitation. Papa, will you tell me the well story again? It had become a favorite bedtime tale, the story of how Matthew had ridden up to the property and offered to dig for water, and how he had found it 30 feet down in the earth, and how that had changed everything. Again, Matthew said, ruffling his son's hair. I told you that story last night. But I like it, Thomas insisted. Tell it again. So Matthew told the story again, and Amelia listened with a smile, remembering that first day when she had been so tired and so desperate that she had taken a chance on a stranger. It had been the best decision of her life, letting him stay and dig for water. He had found more than water down in that well shaft. He had found a home, and so had she. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing up of their children. Thomas learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, and Sarah was not far behind him. They helped with chores as soon as they were old enough, feeding chickens and gathering eggs and learning the value of hard work. Matthew taught Thomas about wells and water and how to read the land, while Amelia taught both children about horses and crops and how to make things grow in difficult soil. When Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 5, Amelia found herself pregnant once more. She was 31 now, and Matthew was 34, and they both felt like they had been living this life forever, even though it had only been a decade since that first meeting at the fence line. Another one, Matthew said, his hand on her belly, his face full of wonder. Are we greedy to one another? Maybe, Amelia said, laughing. But I find I do not care. I always wanted a big family. I was so lonely growing up as an only child. This time they had twin boys, born on a stormy March night with rain hammering the roof and wind howling around the corners of the house. It was a difficult birth, and Amelia was exhausted and frightened, but Matthew stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and telling her she was strong. She could do this. He loved her so much. When it was finally over and she had 2 healthy baby boys sleeping beside her, Amelia looked at Matthew through tears of exhaustion and relief and said, "No more. I love them, but no more." Matthew laughed weakly, looking almost as exhausted as she felt. "No more," he agreed. 4 children is plenty. They named the twins Daniel and David, and Thomas and Sarah were beside themselves with excitement at having not just one baby brother but 2. The house that Matthew had built to replace the old cabin, a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a big kitchen, suddenly felt full to bursting with noise and life and love. The next years were a chaos of children and work, of never enough sleep and never enough hours in the day, but also of incredible joy. Amelia would stand at her kitchen window, watching Matthew teach the older children to work while the twins played at their feet, and she would feel a gratitude so profound it made her chest tight. This life, this family, this home, they were everything she had never dared to dream of during those long, lonely months of hauling water 3 miles each direction. The children grew. Thomas became quiet and thoughtful like his father, with a gift for understanding animals and how to gentle them. Sarah was wild and laughing, always climbing trees and racing her brothers and refusing to be left behind just because she was a girl. Daniel and David were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into trouble together, and they had inherited their father's gray eyes and their mother's stubborn determination. By the time Thomas was 16, he was working the ranch alongside Matthew like a full partner, and they had expanded the horse breeding operation into something genuinely profitable. Sarah, at 13, was helping Amelia with the cooking and the garden, but she spent every spare moment in the barn with the horses, and everyone knew she would never be content with just domestic work. The twins at 8 were still young enough to be children, but old enough to have real responsibilities, and they took pride in doing their chores well. Amelia was 40 now, and Matthew was 43, and sometimes she looked at him and marveled at how the years had treated them. His hair was going gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, but he was still strong and capable, still the man who had offered to dig a well for a desperate stranger all those years ago. She knew she had changed too, that motherhood and hard work had marked her, but when Matthew looked at her, she still saw love and desire in his eyes, undiminished by time. "We did all right," he said to her one evening as they sat on the porch in the twilight, watching their children play a game of tag in the yard. "Raising them, I mean. They are good kids." "They are," Amelia agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "We did better than all right. We built something real here, Matthew, something that will last beyond us." He wrapped his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Amelia Pierce. I have loved you since the day I saw you standing in your dooryard covered in dust, too stubborn to admit you needed help." "I love you too," she said, smiling against his shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for staying." "There was never anywhere else I wanted to be," Matthew said simply. As the sun set behind the barn, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the well pump stood silent and steady near the house. It had been 20 years since Matthew had dug that shaft into the earth, since he had broken through rock and found water and changed both their lives forever. The well still produced clear, cold water every day, and it had become a gathering place for the family, where the children would pump water for the horses or fill buckets for the garden, where Amelia would stand sometimes and remember what it had been like before, when water was 3 miles away and hope was a fragile thing. Thomas married at 21, bringing home a sweet-faced girl from town named Lucy, who fell in love with the ranch as quickly as she had fallen in love with Tom. They built a small house on the western section of the property, and Tom started his own horse training business, learning from everything Matthew and Amelia had taught him but making it his own. Within a year, Lucy was pregnant, and Amelia became a grandmother for the first time at 45. Holding her grandson, a tiny boy with Tom's dark hair and Lucy's green eyes, Amelia felt time collapse in on itself. She remembered being the young woman alone on this land, desperate for water and hope. She remembered Matthew riding up the road and offering help. She remembered the long weeks of digging and the moment they had found water together. She remembered their wedding and the births of their children and all the years of work and love that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, standing beside her with his arm around her waist, looking down at their grandson with wonder on his face. "I am thinking about that day when my buckets broke," Amelia said softly. I am thinking about how I sat in the dust and cried because I thought I could not keep going. And I am thinking about how glad I am that I got back up and made the walk anyway, because if I had not, I would have missed everything, all of this. Matthew pulled her closer. I am glad too. Every single day I am glad I found you. Sarah never married, though she had plenty of suitors. She stayed on the ranch, building her own reputation as a horse trainer and breeder, and she was happy in a way that had nothing to do with traditional expectations. The twins left for a few years in their early 20s, needing to see what else was out there, but they both came back eventually, drawn home by the land and the family and the life they had always known. Matthew and Amelia grew old together on the land they had built. Matthew's hair went fully white, and his hands became gnarled with arthritis, but he still walked the property every morning, checking on things and taking pride in what they had created. Amelia's dark hair turned silver, and her back bothered her when the weather changed, but she still worked in her garden and still broke horses when they needed training. They had been married 40 years when Matthew had a stroke. It was not severe, but it left him weakened on his left side and unable to do the heavy physical work he had always taken such pride in. Amelia cared for him fiercely, helping him with exercises to regain his strength, and slowly he improved. He would never be quite what he had been, but he could walk and talk, and most importantly, he could still sit on the porch with Amelia and watch the sun set over their land. "I am sorry," he said to her one evening, his speech still slightly slurred. "I am sorry I cannot help more." "You have helped enough for 10 lifetimes," Amelia said firmly, taking his hand. "You dug me a well when I had nothing. You gave me a family and a home and 40 years of love. You have nothing to apologize for." "Still," Matthew said quietly, "I wish I could do more." "You are here," Amelia said simply. "That is enough. That is everything." They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had grown into something substantial, with multiple houses dotting the property and 3 generations working the land together. The original well still stood near the big house, its pump now more than 50 years old but still functional, still drawing water from deep in the earth. During the anniversary celebration, Thomas stood up to make a toast. He was 49 now, with gray in his own hair and children who were nearly grown, and he looked at his parents with open love and respect. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "They taught us that love is more than words, that it is showing up every day and doing the work that needs to be done. My father dug a well for my mother before she was his wife, before she was even his friend, just because she needed water and he knew how to find it. That well has sustained this entire ranch for 50 years. But more than that, their love has sustained this entire family. They built something here that will last for generations, and we are all grateful beyond measure." Amelia cried happy tears, and Matthew held her hand with his good one, and they were surrounded by the life they had built together, by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by horses and gardens and buildings they had constructed with their own hands, by love that had started with a simple act of service and had grown into something vast and enduring. Matthew died peacefully in his sleep at 78, with Amelia beside him in the bed they had shared for more than 50 years. She woke in the morning to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. She did not cry right away. She sat there for a long time, holding his hand and remembering everything. The day he had ridden up to her fence line, the weeks of digging, the moment they had found water together, their wedding, their children, 50 years of mornings waking up beside him and evenings falling asleep in his arms. "Thank you," she whispered finally, kissing his forehead one last time. "Thank you for everything." They buried him on the highest point of the property, with a view of the entire ranch spread out below and the well visible in the distance. The whole family gathered, and Sarah spoke about her father's quiet strength and his patience, and the way he had never made her feel like she should be anything other than what she was. The twins talked about his sense of humor and the way he had taught them to work hard without complaining. Thomas talked about the well, about how his father had dug for water and found a family instead, and how that single act of kindness had shaped all their lives. Amelia was 75 years old, and she missed Matthew with an ache that never quite went away. But she was not alone. She was surrounded by family, by the ranch they had built together, by the evidence of their love everywhere she looked. She still walked the property every morning, moving more slowly now but still steady, still strong. She still worked in her garden, and still advised her children and grandchildren about horses and crops and the best way to handle difficult soil. On her 80th birthday, sitting on the porch with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all around her, Amelia looked out at the land and felt profound contentment. The well still stood near the house, its pump old but still functional, still drawing water from the deep places in the earth. It had been more than 60 years since Matthew had dug that shaft, since he had broken through rock and found water and changed everything. "Tell us the well story, Grandma," one of her great-grandchildren asked, climbing into her lap despite being almost too big for it. So Amelia told the story one more time. She told them about the drought and the broken buckets and the 3-mile walk to the creek. She told them about the day a stranger rode up to her fence line and offered to work for room and board. She told them about the weeks of digging and the moment they found water together, 30 feet down in the earth. She told them about falling in love while building something that mattered, about how sometimes the best things in life come from simply showing up and doing the work that needs to be done. "Grandpa Matthew saved our whole ranch," one of the children said seriously when she finished. "No," Amelia corrected gently. "We saved it together. That is what love is, you know. It is two people working side by side toward something bigger than either of them could achieve alone. Remember that, all of you. Love is not just words or feelings. Love is digging wells and building homes and staying when things get hard. Love is showing up every single day and doing the work together." She lived 3 more years, long enough to see Tom's oldest daughter married and to hold her first great-great-grandchild. She died at 83, peacefully in her sleep, in the same bed where Matthew had died 5 years earlier. They buried her beside him on the hill, and the whole family gathered again to say goodbye to the woman who had been stubborn enough to hold onto a piece of land through drought and desperation, brave enough to trust a stranger who offered help, and strong enough to build a legacy that would last for generations. The well still stands, more than 70 years after Matthew Pierce first broke ground. It has been repaired and maintained by his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but it still draws water from the same deep aquifer he found in 1878. The ranch still thrives, spread across hundreds of acres now, home to multiple families all descended from the woman who hauled water 3 miles and the man who dug her a well. And on summer evenings, when the air is warm and the light is golden, children still gather around the old well pump and listen to stories about their great-great-grandparents, about a drought and a stranger and an act of kindness that changed everything. They learn that love is more than romance, that it is also service and sacrifice, and showing up to do hard work for people who need help. They learn that sometimes the most important things in life come from the simplest acts, from offering help to someone in need and staying long enough to see it through. The water still flows clear and cold, drawn up from 30 feet below the earth, and it sustains not just bodies but memory, not just crops but legacy. It is a testament to what two people can build together when they combine love with labor, hope with hard work, faith with action. It is proof that sometimes the best way to find what you are looking for is to help someone else find what they need. And that home is not a place you find, but something you build, one bucket of water and one act of love at a time.